All right, welcome to you all to this evening's panel discussion on the fabulous and controversial new exhibit at Houston's Museum of Natural Science, entitled Lucy's Legacy, The Hidden Treasures of Ethiopia. My name is Susan McIntosh. I'm the director of Scientia, and I'm also a member of the anthropology department, and these are the two organizations that are co-sponsoring tonight's discussion. Whether you depend primarily on local or national media outlets and newspapers, you have undoubtedly encountered the controversies over this exhibit. And they have focused in the media on two issues. Number one, whether fossils as significant as those of Lucy should travel outside of their vault in Ethiopia for purposes of museum exhibit. And it's primarily paleoanthropologists and museum curators who have been arguing over this issue. And number two, whether it is ethical for a museum to host an exhibit that will serve to legitimate and to generate funds for a repressive government. This is the issue raised by the Ethiopian Community Organization in Houston. A number of people, knowing that I am an Africanist archaeologist, asked me about these controversies and whether a concern for human rights and cultural sensitivities should influence their decision on whether or not to attend the exhibit. Hearing them talk about the very polarized positions represented in the media, the fossils are too fragile to travel without getting damaged. Nonsense, the Dead Sea Scrolls traveled here without getting damaged. Negotiating with the Ethiopian government involves dirty politics. Museums have very little to do with politics, they just display artifacts. Well, it occurred to me, hearing these polarized positions, that there actually are more issues to be considered here, and that is the origin of this panel discussion. Now, in an editorial, the Houston Chronicle advised that sometimes a fossil is just a fossil. And I would agree, sometimes it is. But when the fossil is, as Time magazine phrased it, a rock star, making no apology for the fossil pun, I would like to suggest that what that fossil is and what that fossil means are neither self-evident nor simple. It is, of course, the extraordinary completeness and great antiquity at 3.2 million years of Lucy as a member of the group of fossil hominids that share with us the very odd habit of walking fully upright that have made her the most familiar icon of early hominid evolution. She is the lightning rod attracting these controversies precisely because of her iconic status. But don't let that obscure the fact that the museum is the site where the battles are being waged because of its cultural authority and the legitimizing imprimatur its exhibits enjoy. The idea that museums of science use this authority to simply put the facts of science on display dissolved in the wake of the cultural upheavals of the 1960s. Particularly where human cultures and human remains are concerned, it became clear that both the content and the mode of museum display were deeply political in the sense of being involved in the workings of power. Through the process of inclusion and exclusion in the content of a display, the choice of stories told in the exhibits, and their mode of display, museums communicate ideas about what is central and what is peripheral, what must be included and what must be kept out, what is valued and what is useless, what is essential, what is marginal. They send powerful messages about the order of the world and the place of different groups within it. Once this was understood, it was only natural that different voices would be raised over the content and mode of displays, the values they communicated, and the stories they told. Viewed in this light, the Lucy controversies become both more understandable and more interesting, I think. The Ethiopian Community Organization's outrage has to do with the cultural authority of the museum and the legitimation they see it conferring upon a government they abhor. The debate over the transport of the fossils may be only partly about concerns with damage and partly about issues of control and access. The rhetoric of Richard Leakey wants Lucy to be viewed only in Ethiopia or only by scientists and analogizes her exhibition in Houston to prostitution. There's another aspect, though, not much talked about, that concerns me and interests me much more. And that is the large segment of this exhibit that is concerned with Ethiopia's historical development. This is not the kind of exhibit that museums have traditionally offered for sub-Saharan Africa. The African exhibits in the museums of my youth, which of course had a significant influence on how I imagined Africa before I actually went there and began working, were of two kinds. The Africa of primitive peoples, colorful, exotic, and animist, admirably represented here in all three guises by a single people, the Maasai. And this imagined Africa very quickly morphs into another popular imaginary of our times, Africa, the hopeless, tribally rent, and barbarically violent continent. And both are underlain, of course, by a rhetoric of primitivism. And another imagining about Africa as nature primordial, unmarked by human occupation, dominated by large, charismatic fauna. In earlier times, the prey of hunters. You see the black and white photo of lions in a sort of early version of a diorama. These were lions killed by Teddy Roosevelt and put on display in 1909. And then the later development of that diorama, African lions. Again, these are dioramas from the American Museum of Natural History. Now, of course, these animals are the prey of photographers on safari. So the museum diorama is one of the most enduring transmitters of this African imaginary. Let us think what it means that urban Africa and professional Africans are not part of the popular imagination. We see here a picture of Abuja, the capital of Nigeria, and Nigerian professionals in Abuja. And then let us think about what it means to encounter another kind of African museum exhibit that considers a rich and complex history extending back 2,000 years that has nothing of the primitive about it. So with that framework, let's turn to the remarks of our panelists who represent a range of perspectives, which we hope will be further expanded by members of our audience in the question and answer period that will follow the panelists' comments. We've asked each of them to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm going to introduce all of them first before they begin speaking. Okay, let me start at the far end. We have John Kappelman, who is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. He grew up on a family farm in southwestern Idaho and received his BS in geology and geophysics from Yale and a PhD in anthropology in earth and planetary science, in anthropology and earth and planetary sciences from Harvard. The primary focus of his research is in hominoid evolution and human origins and evolution. He conducts field and laboratory research in paleontology, stratigraphy, and paleomagnetism, and laboratory research in functional morphology and computer imaging. He has carried out field work in Asia and Africa and has current field projects in Turkey and Ethiopia. He's also started the award-winning website www.eskeletons.org and is soon to launch the websites www.elucy.org and www.efossils.org. And also coming to a computer near you, www.eforensics.info. Org was purchased by someone else. Okay. And then we have Gezahgen Kebede. He is Honorary Consul General of Ethiopia here in Houston since 2000. He's the president of the Ethio-American Trade and Investment Council, a nonprofit organization that he founded in 1996, the main purpose of which is to promote tourism, business, and enterprise between Ethiopia and the United States. He's also been a business consultant and has been living in Houston since 1984. Dirk van Tuerenhout is a native of Belgium. He studied at the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium and received a master's in ancient history and a master's in art history and archaeology from that institution. He then attended Tulane University in New Orleans, where he received a master's in anthropology as well as a doctorate with a specialty in pre-Columbian archaeology. He's done fieldwork in Belgium, Belize, and Guatemala, and has been with the Houston Museum of Natural Science since 1999. He is, of course, the curator of the Lucy exhibit. And Rebecca Storey studied biological anthropology and archaeology at the Penn State University, where her thesis concerned the osteology of a residential compound in pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica. She is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Houston main campus, where she has taught since 1984. Although her specialty is not paleoanthropology, she has taught the Human Origins course to several generations of U of H students. Paleoanthropology has interested her since she discovered anthropology while an undergraduate, an epiphany that we hope will arrive for many more of our undergraduates. Jeff Fleischer is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology here. He studied for many years at the University of Virginia, where he earned his BA, MA, and PhD in anthropology. He's an archaeologist who has worked on projects in many parts of the United States, but has for the last 14 years been conducting research in Eastern Africa. His research focuses on the development of indigenous city-states on the coastal corridor and their connections to continental Africa and ports along the Indian Ocean. So with those introductions, let me ask Gezahgen to come up and make the first introductory set of comments.
Can I do something?
Yes, sorry, we're speaking from the table.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Good evening, everybody. I was expecting a very few crowd, but this is an exciting crowd to see. I would like to start by saying that 6 years ago, I'm the one of few people who started to bring Lucy to North America. When we decided to do that, there was a trade delegation that I invited from Ethiopia to come to Houston in 2003. On our dinner discussion, myself and the former tourism commissioner, we talked about the idea of promoting Ethiopia. As you all know, as Susan mentioned it, not only the whole Africa, but that's not also particular for Ethiopia. The image of Ethiopia is that of the negative, the famine, the war, or the disaster. A lot of people doesn't know the true story of Ethiopia. So when this idea came in 2001, we have a big exhibition in Hanover, Germany, that we took the replica of Lucy, and we have 2.1 million people saw it on that exhibition. So when the commissioner, myself, and other council member, Judah Bani, used to be mayor pro tem, when we mentioned about bringing the real Lucy, and I really jumped on it, and not only just to bring Lucy for the scientific research that we have right now, or as Susan mentioned, the controversy, but the controversy as it is, I will leave it for the expert to talk about it. But the main purpose of the Ethiopian government to bring Lucy is to tell the true story of Ethiopia and the people of Ethiopia. And as I said earlier, the Western media distort Ethiopian image. So why don't we bring the real Lucy, and with that also people talk about Lucy. By the way, there is more than 150 different artifacts around Ethiopia that tell the true and complete story of Ethiopia. As you all know or may not know, Ethiopia is the only country today that the three religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, harmoniously live in Ethiopia. That by itself also has a big validity. Ethiopia, Christianity started way back in 17 BC. As a matter of fact, we were mentioning in some points that Ethiopia has 3,000 years of history, but Ethiopia became Christianity before Christ. So, and it's that and more of the stuff that it tells will tell the complete story of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the only country has the written and the spoken language called Amharic, driven from Semitic. Ethiopia is the only country in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe the rest of the world, that has their own calendar. We have our own calendar. Right now, today, we are in Gregorian calendar in the year 1999. in 4 days, we will celebrate our new millennium. So when people come to visit Ethiopia, we always tell them, welcome home, and come to Ethiopia to be 7 years younger, because that's the difference on the age. So the overall of the countries, historical significance is not really being known by the Western, but that's the whole idea when we start bringing in this Lucy exhibition. Yes, it took us 6 years. It's a very long process, both politically, bureaucracy, and a lot of things has to be integrated. But I personally made sure that it's coming to Houston, and if it comes to Houston Museum of Natural Science, and that's the first stop, and that's why we did it. And I hear a lot of rhetoric about controversy. Controversy is good, and by the way, it also helped the museum sell tickets, so they sold a lot of tickets, which is good. But aside that, controversy, bringing this museum, will really bring a lot of big significance to Houston as well. And I heard a lot of, rumors and this and that from Smithsonian. Would you believe this? In 2004, when I first invited the Ethiopian tourism to come to Houston with our ambassador, now he's an ambassador, Ambassador Kasauna Yele is an ambassador in Belgium, Smithsonian was the first one that invited, and the Smithsonian was the first one who wants to get this. Now I guess because of jealousy and whatever, but they are making a lot of rumors. But it is here in Houston. I'm hoping all of you will be there and visit it and come and learn, and also come and visit Ethiopia. Thank you.
So Jeff is the next speaker.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to, if I don't read, I'll go on for an hour or so. Let me begin by saying that although I'm an archaeologist, my area of expertise is about as far from the periods in which Lucy lived as possible. In archaeological time, which may seem a lot to you, I work in the very recent past, the last 1,000 years until today. While this sets me at a great disadvantage to talk about Lucy, her significance, or the scientific ethics surrounding her transport to Houston, it does mean that my own research concerns are quite contemporary with some of the most spectacular monumental finds in Ethiopia, and in fact the continent of Africa at large. I'm talking in particular about the tall stone stele of the Aksumite state that developed in northern Ethiopia during the first centuries of the Common Era, and the rock-cut churches at Lalibela during the late 11th and 12th century, just to name a few. This is not the time nor the place to discuss the details of these unfortunately, fantastically complex and interesting places. And in fact, that's one of the first points that I'd like to make about the controversy surrounding this exhibit. For Americans, there are in fact few times or places where the societies in Africa are presented in ways that emphasize their complexity, their international connections, and the deep historical importance. As I teach classes on African prehistory or on complex societies in Africa, I'm constantly shocked, and this is really almost every time I teach these classes, I'm constantly shocked at the limited and extraordinarily biased perspectives that Americans students carry with them about Africa. Whenever I complete sections on these African societies in which we examine the places like Aksum, as well as Great Zimbabwe, or the Swahili city-states, these names may mean nothing to you, so you should go out and look them up, and the empires of the Western Sudan, students invariably come up to me after class to express both their surprise and consternation about what we've been learning. They're surprised because this material transforms their image of Africa from a place of poverty, disease, and backwardness to one where states and empires rose and fell, and where people confronted the challenges in front of them and developed strategies to not only survive, but to build enduring monuments and societies. Their consternation, however, comes from how they feel so deficient in their understanding of this part of the world, and they often ask me, why weren't we taught this before? That's the most common question I hear. And honestly, I don't have a good answer for them. The main reason I mention this is because in all of the debates over the movement and transport of Lucy, I think we've lost sight of the larger historical story that the exhibit hopes to explore. Places like Aksum and Lalibela are crucial parts of that history, and the power of the presentation of them to an American public cannot be overstated. However, let me make it clear that I'm not arguing that the political problems that have emerged in the debate over this exhibit be washed away in order for Americans to learn about Africa. To be sure, archaeologists have grown increasingly aware of and sensitive to the way that their research on past societies has implications for the politics of the present. As Faulkner said of the American South, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. But as archaeologists have found, in order for productive debates to occur about the past, or for that matter the present, we need to understand that past. And that's why this discussion tonight is so important, because it allows those who want to learn about the politics of the past and the present to hear and ask questions. By closing down the discussion, Americans will remain ignorant not only of the rich history of Ethiopia, but of the way that history has become so contentious for people today. Thank you.
I'm very honored to be able to speak to you tonight. And up here I have Her Story is Your Story, which is one of the themes that the museum puts up about the Lucy exhibit. And talk a little bit here, as I said from the introduction, as Susan told you from the introduction, I'm not a paleoanthropologist. I am a skeletal osteologist for humans, and I do study, but my people are much more recent than Lucy. But I teach and have taught at the University of Houston for over 20 years human origins, and try to introduce students to the whole story of human ancestors and the evolution of humans here in Houston. All right, so that's how I come at it, but that the main reason to exhibit Lucy is educational, or at least that's what this one is. I had the privilege of attending the Ancestors Conference in 1984 at the American Museum of Natural History. Not the conference so much, but the exhibit. They had a great big conference, and they brought fossils from all over the world. And I had the opportunity to go in and see the exhibit and see the actual fossils. And it was just wonderful to be able to see things that you had seen pictures of or even casts of, but had never realized exactly what they looked like. And I got to see Neanderthals and Homo erectus and Australopithecus africanus. And I have never forgotten that. So when I found out Lucy was coming here, I thought that was very exciting. Now, it has two purposes, this exhibit, and Jeff has already talked a lot about this one, and that is to learn about Ethiopia. I'm afraid that most people here in the United States actually are tremendously ignorant about lots of the other parts of the world. And for such a powerful and rich country, that is a very, very sad situation. Now, that probably doesn't apply to you people in this room, but all kinds of polls show that the ignorance about other countries is really tremendous here. So you get an opportunity to learn about Ethiopia. Also, the education is about human evolution. Whoops, I need to go back. Right. So here, learning about Ethiopia. And really, I was impressed when I saw it about the rich religious heritage and about also its importance as a fossil locality. So you get these two aspects to Ethiopia. And even my students have commented on how they didn't expect that. They didn't expect to get all that Ethiopian stuff about the history of it and the three religions and all the buildings and the monuments they had, and how impressed they were really to learn about it, because again, they had never heard about it. Now, the other thing that they say in the thing is, how do you relate, right? How do you relate? Well, certainly, as a person familiar with the human skeleton, which I am, the thing that has always struck me about Lucy is how human she really is from the neck down, but also how very small she is. And no matter how much you read it in the textbooks and all that kind of stuff, seeing it really amazes you. All right. Now, why is it important for human evolution? The evolution of humans is controversial in the United States, although I must admit that I have, by and large, not had too much controversy from my students at the University of Houston. Most of them come up and say, why is everybody so afraid of human evolution? Because when you look at it and you look at the evidence for it, it doesn't seem to be frightening. It seems to make sense. And the evidence is that I misspelled although, sorry, teaching in college, many students do not believe it. And I'm sure that's a part of my students as well, but they don't tell me that. They tell other people. So the other thing that I think is really important about it, and my students are excited, is that being able to actually see her size and see her bones and get a feel for her in an intense way is really exciting, because seeing is believing. Come on. Oh, no. Stuck. I don't know why. There it is. Okay. Now, one of the things, of course, so talking a little bit more about this educational part. Oh, no. Slow. I need to go to this one, number 5, right there. And now what? Anyway, that article, there it is, thank you. And you just fool around on the internet sometimes as a teacher looking for things. And here I found this one here about the new evidence that Lucy was a knuckle walker. And of course it comes from a site that really is arguing about evolution. And so that, again, that's why being able to see one of our probable ancestors is an important thing for people here. And said Lucy is a knuckle walker. And of course, if you read the article, then they say, no, she can't have possibly walked upright because they have evidence that she had vestiges. Now, maybe they don't understand what the word vestige of knuckle walking means. But in essence, that article says that in essence, she knuckle walked because she has vestiges of knuckle walking in her wrist bones, all right? Now here, this is an old slide, show you Lucy is at the top left, a modern human at the bottom left, and a chimpanzee on the right. And you can definitely see Lucy's link to the human and to our mode of walking as opposed to the knuckle walker, the chimp, right? So, but again, when you look at it, and they say, well, you don't have toe bones, somebody doesn't have, how do you know they walked upright? You don't have toe bones. She doesn't have a head either. So, she has a mandible, a jaw. But there's so many other things on that skeleton that do tell you that she walks upright. And in the exhibit, you get a chance to see the replica in a 3D, as if it were in the body, and you also see a complete characterization of her with hair and all that kind of stuff, which makes it interesting to go along with being able to look at the bones. All right. But I think the main problem is, of course, and this is, I think the one in the museum is actually a little bit better, but I found this one on the internet, so, of her face. This is what bothers people about human evolution right there, is that her head looks like that. And it really brings a primate characterization too bad. And they don't think of the fact that we are all the descendants of survivors, of people that could adapt. And it looked like that is just the way it was. Now, I understand the controversy because with my dealings in Latin America, I understand patrimony is very important, the patrimony of a nation. And you can understand that maybe it's too long a time on tour, as was one of the problems people had about it. And something else that I think I'm with, their fears that something bad will happen is probably less than not totally trusting that Lucy will return. And I deal with that all the time, that they don't, this question of patrimony is one of the biggest ones that's being facing many societies right now. And I just bring you up from my own research here. This is Lady Xoc from the site of Yaxchilan in Mexico, from the classic Maya. Beautiful, and one of the most beautiful sculptures that there is from the Maya area. It doesn't belong to Mexico, it belongs to the British Museum. And Mexico cannot get it back. And then here are the Elgin marbles, another example of this question about whether or not, patrimony. So maybe underneath the thing, I think, is a fear on the part of Ethiopia, because it is part of their national patrimony and they have it. And so they should, that it won't come back, because so many things never have. And then, of course, well, here. It's just lots of fun to think about evolution and then play with it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right? Come on. All right. Oh, no. Well, see. I need the last cartoon. The last cartoon I really like because it makes quite a point, I think. I really liked this cartoon when I got it, and I subscribed to the New Yorker, and I really laughed, and I'll leave it there. I understand, Richardson. I don't believe in evolution, but I do believe in Darwinism. And that's where I fear the United States too often is. We believe in survival of the fittest, but not in the greater story of evolution. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to start by thanking Dr. Susan McIntosh for a kind invitation to participate in the panel discussion tonight, and also express my gratitude to Scientia and the Rice University Anthropology Department for co-sponsoring the event. As curator of the exhibit, I can readily identify 3 areas rather than 2 in which this exhibit has, shall we say, generated heated debates. And I see the following, and they're mentioned before. There is debate within the scientific community. There is debate within the Ethiopian community in Houston and in the United States at large. And there is a debate going on within the community of people who favor creationism or intelligent design rather than Darwinian evolution. Before I discuss these different arenas, I would like to make one important point, and it has already been made, but I would like to re-emphasize it. This exhibit is the result of an initiative that was taken by the Ethiopian government. And the Museum of Natural Science here in Houston was selected by the government to build the exhibit, to host it as the premier venue, and then eventually also to organize a tour in the United States for a period of 6 years in which 10 other museums will host Lucy and the story of Ethiopia. So allow me now to address the concerns, first of all, raised by the scientific community. In the weeks and days, as I'm sure you are aware of, leading up to the opening of the exhibit, the media were saturated with press releases from a group of concerned paleoanthropologists. And their concerns pertain to 4 different aspects of the exhibit. And these are, first of all, there are concerns related to Lucy's travels overseas and the inherent danger of such a trip across the ocean. Secondly, there are concerns that she is traveling for the purpose of being displayed as opposed to further scientific study. Third, there are concerns related to the perceived excessive and repeated handling of Lucy during the 6-year tour of her exhibit here in the United States. And fourth and last, there are concerns related to Lucy being unavailable to scientists for further research during those 6 years. Here are the facts as we see them at the museum. Lucy has been to the United States before, and she traveled by air in 1975. At that time, she was taken to the Cleveland Museum of Natural History to be studied by Dr. Johansson, who was the same person, of course, who found her, and who happened to be the curator at that museum at that time. Now, I would like to mention to you, and perhaps you all know this already, but when she traveled in 1975, she did so in a suitcase with each of her bones wrapped in toilet paper. It was probably charming, it was high quality toilet paper. However, when she traveled to Houston this year, she traveled in 2 custom-made, tightly sealed suitcases. Her bones were each packed separately in a protective plastic matrix and then placed in slits that were made in museum quality foam that was placed inside these suitcases. Moreover, the design of these suitcases, as well as the foam, was handled by 3 conservators on the US side, on the part of the museum, who had been to Ethiopia before to study the bones and who had worked very closely with their counterparts, especially the gentleman from Ethiopia who has been in charge of Lucy's remains for the last 20 years. And it was not until he was happy with the design of the whole 9 yards, as they say, that we were happy. Eventually, when all was said and done, Lucy's curator accompanied the bones in the suitcases, as did the director of the National Museum of Ethiopia, where the bones are kept, and our friend, the Honorary Consul of Ethiopia, residing here in Houston, His Excellency Gezahgen Kebede, who is with us tonight. Our intention is to have the same Ethiopian gentleman, the curator, handle her bones during the installation and deinstallation over the entire 6-year run of the exhibit. In other words, nobody else is going to be touching the bones, but the same person who's been doing this before. As I mentioned, this is the second time that she has traveled to the United States. And the main differences between the 2 trips is that she originally traveled to the United States for the purpose of being studied, while on her current trip the primary goal, but not necessarily the only goal, is to go on public display. The only other difference I can identify is that in 2007, no toilet paper was harmed in the preparation leading up to the exhibit. In 1998, a group of 37 paleoanthropologists from the United States, Ethiopia, and other parts of the world signed a recommendation in which they stated that the fossilized remains of early hominids should not be allowed to travel for purposes other than research, provided that such research could not be carried out in the country of origin. This concern about the safeguarding of Lucy is also shared by the staff at HMNS, myself included. And like all other museums, we have long-standing policies in place to ensure that all objects, as well as fossilized remains, be they dinosaurs or in this case early hominids, are kept safe. This is what all museums do on a daily basis. We cannot emphasize that enough. Moreover, as has been mentioned already, over the past few years, the museum has hosted exhibits with truly fragile items. The Dead Sea Scrolls comes to mind. Talk about sneezing once and they're gone. Not so with the bones. And we did not sneeze, by the way. While the primary reason for Lucy's presence is to share her with the general public, there is also a possible secondary purpose for her presence here. The University of Texas has prepared and submitted a research proposal requesting permission for Lucy to go to Austin for the purpose of being CAT scanned. Over the past 2 years, 2 different Ethiopian delegations have traveled to Austin, where they observed the facilities firsthand and became familiar with the non-invasive and non-destructive procedure involving Lucy. But I defer to Dr. Kappelman to elaborate on this topic. It is essential, however, to recognize that Lucy was found now 33 years ago, almost to the day, and that she spent several years in Cleveland being studied, and that over the 33 years since her discovery, an enormous amount of data has been generated by scientists. However, as was pointed out by the Ethiopian ambassador to the United States, present at the museum a week ago, now is the time to share her with the general public. Next, I would like to address the concerns raised by the Ethiopian community in Houston. The Ethiopian community in Houston, or ECHO, and the museum have been in touch, were in touch, at the very beginning of the project. We had several very productive meetings at the museum, and I, in fact, was also invited to address the community meeting, or a community meeting, in January of 2006 to update everybody on where we stood with the exhibit. During all of these meetings, we discussed the general outline of the exhibit, and we invited comments and input regarding the storyline to make sure that we covered all relevant aspects of the history and prehistory. And we did the same, by the way, in Ethiopia, asking our counterparts in academia and museum world to help us out. We also invited, with regard to meeting people here in Houston, we also invited members of the organization to become docents at our museum. And the logic here is straightforward and very simple. Who better to share Ethiopian culture than people who are from Ethiopia? And I must say that the initial response to this request was positive. However, when questions were raised eventually regarding financial arrangements as well as aspects of security, we politely conveyed that such information is routinely kept confidential. This is, and I need to stress this, standard operating procedure in the museum world. At that point, or soon thereafter, communications between the museum and the community organization ceased. I want to emphasize, however, that the museum remains committed to inclusiveness, and we continue to extend an invitation to Ethiopian expatriates all over to come see the exhibit. And I'm happy to say a lot of them have done so already, as well as considering to become docents, as I hope some will. And finally, let me also address very briefly the concerns that are raised or have been raised by individuals who favor creationism or intelligent design rather than the concept of Darwinian evolution. We at the museum are respectful of everyone's religious opinions. And in fact, the museum in the past hosted a presentation which put forth points of view that were more creationist or intelligent design than anything else. While this is not an endorsement, it does represent a serious attempt to engage in dialogue. Moreover, we also have had communications, emails or otherwise, from concerned parents to the museum who wanted to know what to tell their children. All of their communications have been answered promptly and fully. And on a personal note, and I'll end with this, I've had several email exchanges with a teacher at the Scottsdale Christian Academy in Phoenix, Arizona, just a few days ago. And I was gratified to receive the following final expression of appreciation. Thank you very much. I'm quoting now. I have printed out your reply, and we will examine it in class. I appreciate your thoroughness with my email. It is refreshing to get replies. So often, no one replies. We will spend part of a class period on this. Again, thank you. And so I think that sums it up very well. Thank you very much for your patience.
I'd like to echo Dirk's comments and thanks to Susan and the organizers for putting this together, and also to the panelists for their comments and their different views that they're bringing to this tonight, to you for attending, and I know I speak for the panelists when I say that we look forward to your comments and questions as well. I'm going to spend just a few minutes here so that we can have lots of time for questions, talking about the significance of the fossil itself. But first I wanted to just emphasize and second Mr. Kebede on his comments about Ethiopia being such a unique country. I've worked there for the past 15 years, came in right after the communist Derg had been overthrown, so it was a very interesting time to start work there. And being a professor at UT, we're responsible for returning in all of our receipts and things that we have to document all of this work that we've done and make sure that the bills are paid. And you can imagine the accountants in the tower, when I submitted a stack of our usual receipts, something like this, most of them in Amharic, that the lights in the tower dimmed when they looked at these and wondered, you know, Kappelman, what are you trying to pull? These receipts are dated in 1987. You know? They're 7 years old. What are you trying to do to us? And there are 13 months here. So there are also 13 months on the calendar. So that's always been, I see every opportunity as a teaching opportunity, so our accountants now are very familiar with the Ethiopian calendar and the fact that there's a 7-year difference in between the two points there. Well, I really do hope that all of you have the opportunity to attend the exhibit, because I see this for myself as well as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to actually see Lucy within the context of a very rich cultural history and tradition of Ethiopia. And it is the case, as Rebecca mentioned, that people in this country don't understand world geography, yet alone our own geography for the most part. And Ethiopia has often been portrayed as the cradle of humanity. And the fact is, the fossil record that's been produced from Ethiopia up to the point with Lucy's discovery and in the past 33 years is remarkable. There's no other country on Earth that shows that history, that time depth. Just 2 weeks ago, were published some of the very first probable gorilla fossils from Ethiopia. The work continues on almost a monthly, weekly basis there. Stuff continues to come out of the ground all of the time. But the question remains, what's important about Lucy? Why Lucy? This fossil was found 33 years ago. It's been studied exhaustively. Well, the fact is that when we're out looking for fossils, most of the fossils that we find are very fragmentary specimens. Most of those specimens may be a single tooth, an isolated tooth, maybe a handful of teeth, maybe just a bit of bone. For the most part, it's very, very hard to become a good fossil, that there are lots of things out there working at every corner to prevent that process from occurring. And what's remarkable about Lucy is what's often portrayed there as her 40% completeness. And Rebecca showed some pictures of that here. And if you look through that there are portions of limb elements from the right side or the left side preserved. In some cases, we have a right and a left. But there's enough of Lucy preserved there that we can easily, with our mind's eye, being trained the way we always are in looking at symmetry and things, that we can easily flip over those rights to lefts, lefts to right, and actually fill in that outline in our own mind's eye. By having the skeleton being so complete, we can ask questions of the Lucy specimen that we can't even begin to ask out of an isolated tooth or an isolated fragment of a femur. So, for example, some of the things that were of great surprise with Lucy is that she does combine a remarkable constellation of different sorts of characters. As Rebecca mentioned, from, I would argue more from the waist down, she's very human-like, that there's no question at all when we look at that anatomy that when she was on the ground, she was walking in a bipedal fashion, one foot after the other. That's knowledge that we had from other fossils from her species, Australopithecus afarensis, but the Lucy specimen made that clear to us in a way that no other isolated specimen could. Some of the interesting points about Lucy, though, is that when we look at her upper extremity, there are many more traits there that look more chimpanzee-like, that her limb proportions are not identical to ours. Her upper limbs were somewhat relatively longer than her legs were. There are features there about her shoulder joint that suggest that she had a higher range of overhead movement than humans have. Her fingers and toes are more curved. That's a feature that's only seen in primates that use trees for some level of support. So when we put that entire picture together for Lucy, what we see is a species that had a variety of different sorts of locomotor modes in its repertoire. Someone who was on the ground walking on two legs, but she also shows clear evidence of probable foraging in the trees. That was an idea, again, from this little skeleton, as you'll see, that upset the world in many ways. And again, there were hints of those data coming through from isolated specimens, but pulling all of this together in a single individual, and we only have one of these for Afarensis, made this point like nothing else did. So we have an animal that was both at home on the ground and in the trees. And those are adaptations that help us to understand a very critical stage of human evolution. As Rebecca also mentioned, she gave you a good anatomical background for Lucy. We don't have much of her skull preserved. There are bits and pieces of it. We have lots of other Afarensis cranial fragments, some beautiful complete skulls. The brain size there was about that of a chimpanzee. And that's, again, one of the differences that we're looking at. Her dentition, though, was more human-like than chimpanzee. So we have these contrasts running back and forth. One of the other points in this field that I work on is trying to reconstruct what the habitats are like, because those represent the selection pressures that drove these adaptations. It was early on thought that bipedalism, walking on two legs, of course, obviously, arose in a savanna setting because that's how you get around on the ground. You want to be able to see over the grass to walk. Well, the reconstruction of Lucy's habitats point to woodland rather than grasslands. And so that upset the savanna hypothesis of human evolution, that it looks like there was this intermediate stage that preceded what we had for later human evolution, especially when we get to the species Homo, when we see the evolution of a more striding biped and also a much larger animal. Those are the kinds of things that we can learn from these more complete skeletons. They're, again, as I mentioned, that paleontologists are pretty good at their business, and there were hints of this. You go back through the literature, you can reconstruct all of those pieces, that there were some workers early on who had the story basically straight, but they had a hard time making a convincing argument. Well, the Lucy specimen nailed that argument down at that point. The second point, and I'll enter in just a minute or two about Lucy, is just what else do we have to learn from her. And I think we've talked about the cultural resources of Ethiopia, but there's also another aspect with how we actually can relate to Lucy or her to us. If you have the opportunity to attend the exhibit, that you'll be able to get up close to the case and examine those bones, and it's a remarkable specimen. As I mentioned, you have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, well, unless you go twice, which you might want to do, to actually look at that exhibit. Dirk would like that, I'm sure. Can you buy a week pass or anything? Or?
We'll work on that.
Okay. But in looking at that specimen, the skeleton is laid out there, and again, it's complete enough that we know what people look like when they're laying down. Well, this is a small individual. You can turn halfway around and see the reconstruction in the flesh of what Lucy looked like, and you'll be amazed, I'm sure, at just how tiny she is. She was a small person. She would have topped out like 120 centimeters, just a little bit over a meter or so, about what most of our kindergartners or small first graders in this country look like. And we've got pretty big kids too, so that's the size and the age range there. What's remarkable, I think, about that for Lucy and for us, and maybe not so much for us adults. There aren't any really young kids here tonight. I saw some young people here, though, but is that she is the size of those kids. And when you take kids, your grandkids or regular kids, to that exhibit, kids can relate to Lucy in a way that the rest of us older folks may not relate to. This is someone who is their size and their scale. And you can see the skeleton laid out there. You can look forward and see another skeleton in an upright position. And it should offer, I think, to everyone really an expanded view of what it means to be human, that there are many different kinds of humans today, but when we take our present, that there's just one, it's our species, modern Homo sapiens. But when we look back into the fossil record, we're looking at a multitude of pasts that at one point were a present. If evolution would have ended 3 million years ago, Lucy would have been it for hominids, and that's what we would have been having to work with, or if an alien race had come down to work on planet Earth. And look, that would have been it. There wouldn't have been any arguments about bipedalism evolving as a way to expand the brain or highly manipulative hands. That wouldn't have been it. And so every past that we find, every fossil, we attempt to look at that as a kind of past present, that it was a present at one point in the past. And Lucy, I think, better than any other fossil that we have, really, she is the most famous fossil on planet Earth, is someone who can permit us to expand that view of what it means to be human, not only at this point in our present, but to look at these multiple paths that our species and our ancestors have evolved through time. Thanks.
Thank you to all of our panelists for those comments, and now we're going to open it up for your questions. We're going to bring a mic up to you, otherwise we won't be able to hear you. So there's one way up there, Dick.
I'd like to ask someone on the panel to comment on the latest thing I saw from Miyavi Leakey saying that the Afarensis, like Lucy, and early Homo lived at the same period of time, and therefore Afarensis couldn't have been in our ancestry. Repeat the question. I read something recently that Miyavi Leakey said that early Homo and Australopithecus afarensis lived contemporary, and therefore that Afarensis could not have been in our ancestry since early Homo obviously was. And so I was wondering if the experts could shower a little light on that.
Oh, I can, yeah, sure. For that question then, that early Homo, as it's dated at present, the earliest specimen that's attributed to early Homo is 2.3 million years in age. Afarensis, as we find it, ends a little bit younger than 3 million years, 2.9, 2.8, somewhere in there. So there's actually no overlap between early Homo, unless Maeve's got something she's sitting on that she hasn't told us about, which is possible. But we don't have any early fossil evidence for Homo greater than 2.3 million years ago. We do have a stone tool record that pushes right up against 2.6 million, but whether or not that's evidence for Homo can be debated because we do have Australopithecines around at that time. Afarensis dates back, and again, it's figuring out for most of these specimens, they're really quite isolated, In '92, actually, the group that I worked with, we found a handful of teeth in southernmost Ethiopia, right off the Kenyan border, that we attribute to Afarensis. And we date those to a little bit more than 4 million years in age. So Afarensis has quite a bit of time depth. That in thinking about these lineages, that many people try to make a single trajectory of fossils through time, but it really looks like that bush was very heavily branched. And I suspect what happened was that when bipedalism was evolved, when it was first, quote, invented, it was such a different kind of an adaptation that permitted an adaptive radiation of these forms out. So it was a very, very bushy tree all the way down to its base. But for early Homo, there is no overlap, so far as I'm aware, between Afarensis and Homo at this point. And again, Meave finds lots of fossils, so there may be something in there that she's got that we don't know about yet.
How thoroughly have you all considered the chance that Lucy is a deviant in her species, or isn't the most common of her group? Possibly abnormal, mutated in any way, maybe size, shape, bones, etc.?
Okay, I'll take that one. Well, if you look across this room, that part of this is just statistical sampling that we have to think about and model into the past. As I look across this room, I'm looking at a fairly limited age range cohort. I've got lots of late teens into 20s here, and then we have some older cohorts in the 30s, 40s, up to 50s and beyond. But we're looking at really a bell-shaped distribution here, that our tails here are very narrow. We have very few young people here and not too many of our seniors, and we have most of our people in the middle. That's how most populations look. And so statistically, what are the chances of sampling in those very small tails? Possible, but again, we're looking at a sample of individuals drawn out of a living population. And most fossils, so far as we know, we have some big samples too, not just out of fossil hominids. Those are where we are, as rare as hen's teeth, but lots of clams and other kinds of bivalves. Things fall around a mean size and shape. So statistically, it's possible. The other test for that, though, is how does Lucy compare with other specimens of Afarensis? She compares essentially the same. What's interesting about the species, though, is it looks like it was sexually dimorphic. That is, that the males were larger than the females. Lucy comes through as one of the smallest individuals of Afarensis, but there are other bits and pieces of Afarensis specimens that are about as small as Lucy is. So in looking at that, all of these pieces fit together in a particular morphological pattern that allows us to say, yeah, we'll put all of these things into this species, Afarensis. So part of it's sampling. There's always the possibility of sampling one of those tails, but if this was a really aberrant individual, chances are she would have been selected out of that population early on. Something probably wouldn't have worked, just to the point where most human points of fertilization, that most fetuses are aborted before the mom even knows they're pregnant, that most of those things just don't work through. So biology often works to prevent those things from coming through that end. But that's a point that's always considered anytime any fossil comes out of the ground. And if it's very different, we generally name a new species for it.
I guess this question's for Dr. Tuerenhout. Did I pronounce that right? Sorry, excuse me. It's been rumored that the Museum of Natural Science here in Houston is paying out between $300,000 to a couple of million to the Ethiopian government for displaying of Lucy. Number one, and also a percentage of the ticket sales. Can you substantiate that? And two, is that a typical contractual agreement?
Thank you for your question. The answer remains the same, and that is those types of financial dealings, as a matter of policy, are never made public. That is no cloak and dagger issue here with this exhibit. That is what the museum does in general, and what museums do in general. I am wondering, for example, if the American Museum of Natural History in New York ever makes those numbers public. I doubt it. We don't either. What I can say, however, it is a good question, because it also indicates there is great interest in what is going on, and that is fine. Part of the proceedings, part of the monies generated by the tour will go back to Ethiopia to benefit Ethiopian museums, and I think that is a worthy cause. As to how much that is, really nobody knows, only at the very end. But so that's as much as I could say. So thank you.
If Lucy is studied in Austin, as someone mentioned earlier, what sorts of information do you hope to find?
Well, I'll answer that. As Dirk had mentioned, when Lucy first came stateside, it was at a point in time, you think about the technology, we had several glitches here tonight. Well, 30 years ago, technology was even at more primitive stages. And one of the technologies that we routinely use today, we take for granted, really, was just invented near that time, and that was CAT scanning. That had only just been invented. And when it was invented, it was designed to image humans. That we're a pretty big critter as far as mammals go, and for the most part, the structures that physicians are interested in seeing are pretty large structures. And so those early CAT scanners were designed to image us down to show the single slice plane through a thickness of 2 to 3 millimeters, something like that. So everything that's in you through a 2 or 3 millimeter slice gets compressed down into a single image. Also, because radiation is involved, we didn't want to cook our patients. And so the radiation levels for medical CTs are really quite low so that we don't induce other artificial cancers coming out of that scanning. Lucy's a rock. And the difficulty with that is that the early she was actually CAT scanned. There were a few scans made, and she was opaque. The energy levels in the medical CT at that point, again, they were designed to look at humans, were so low that they really couldn't image any of the internal geometries. So crank the clock up 23 years, I guess, or so, that 10 years ago, several of us at the University of Texas were working with what's termed today, in some ways, industrial CAT scanning. These are CAT scanners that are used to look at all the intricate machinations, say, of a 747 engine. They can go through and do diagnostic work. Some of these CAT scans are big enough you can drive a car through. The difference is that we're not putting live animals or people in these, so we can crank up the energy levels as needed. The other thing is that we want to look at tiny little things, and so the slice resolution has been increased. So 3 of us at UT were working with those technologies 10 years ago, in fact, and we just decided, you know, this is so great, we need to buy one of these. So we put together a lab at UT Austin that was actually the first high-resolution, high-energy CAT scan system on any academic campus on planet Earth, which we're happy with, proud of, and we've been running that for 10 years now. So the difference is that we can scan very densely mineralized objects. The CAT scanner that we had built for us by a company out of Chicago was designed to our specifications, and the 3 of us were in paleoanthro, paleontology, and mineralogy, so we routinely scan rocks. We do all sorts of things with fossils. It does a beautiful job on bone. But we can definitely do imaging of very, very densely mineralized materials. The other thing is that we are interested in tiny slice thicknesses. So we routinely scan at the thickness of a human hair, which is right, of course human hair is about 100 microns or so in size. We can move our machine down into the single micron levels, 1, 2, 3, up to 5 microns or so. So we can image data at about 2 or 3 orders of magnitude than what your physician will do in the hospital. What that leads us to with Lucy, though, is that her external geometries have been studied. But, for example, if you've ever had if you're a meat eater, you've ever had a steak and it's cut through one of the long bones, you know that the bone looks something like this. Well, if you extrude that bone out like a big straw, we're interested in how thick that wall is. The thickness of the wall tells us about the forces that that individual experienced through their lifetime. Individuals who, for example, are tennis players have much more heavy bone investment in their racket arm than they do in their non-racket arm, that the skeleton responds dynamically depending upon the stress, which is one of the real difficulties of space travel. We get people in space, they're not under gravity, their skeleton starts to disappear. So with Lucy, what we've proposed to the Ethiopian government is that we CT scan the entire skeleton and look at these internal geometries, say of the long bones, that's the cortical bone as it's called, but work that we've been doing more recently looks at the spongy bone that you might also see on inspection of your neck steak. It's the little bone in the ends of the long bones or sometimes in the vertebrae that's built in a complex 3-dimensional series of struts. Those struts are also designed, we've been finding, we always thought this, but we could never really image them in 3D, to resolve forces. And so we think that by looking at this in detail, that we can actually address this question of whether she was using her arms for climbing or not, and how that contrasts with how she was using her lower limb. So that's what we want to try to do with Lucy. There is no CAT scan like that on the African continent, although I don't know what the South African military complex has. There's a good chance they've probably got one there, but they probably wouldn't let us use it on a fossil. So that's one of the opportunities here that we have, is to scan Lucy, and we've proposed that to the Ethiopian ministry, and we're waiting for their response to that proposal.
Yeah, I had actually two questions. One's just how if Lucy's 4 million years old, how exactly is she dated? And then the other question, and what I'm a little more interested in, is it seems like Lucy and a lot of other early hominids are so old that she's completely disconnected from any African culture, even any world culture for that matter. And in that regard, you might regard her as sort of the heritage of the entire human species. And in that regard, then she has a right to be traveled around the world and shown to the public, because she's essentially the sort of representative of all of humanity in ancient history. And I'm wondering, like, how has this come up at all in debates? What do you guys think of this? If there's that right, or if really it should remain part of Ethiopia?
I'll speak to the second question, and I'll do it because I've dealt for many years with cultural patrimony issues, serving on the United States Cultural Property Committee. And so the question of what should travel, whose heritage, and there is a very great interest, and I think it is an absolute good to have a concept of a common heritage of humanity, and that material moves and is exchanged. That is on one side. On the other side, understanding a structure of custodianship, of guardianship of material to make sure that it is treated properly is a very complex one, and the system that we currently have to do that is that of the nation state, and having governments that serve as custodians. And so we have this complex thing of governments having to be the ones who say things can travel, but one ideally wants to create an atmosphere where exchanges of materials in good faith and with trust occur as a common event, so that in fact materials can move, people can see them. But if we talk about common heritage of humanity without any structure for guardianship of that common heritage, then we get into trouble. And then you had a question about dating, which probably any of us here, but could
I would like to add on that, on
Yes, you want to
the
address
second
that,
question, because one of the convincing argument that, matter of fact, myself and so many of us that we're planning to bring this Lucy here, is the agreement that Lucy belongs to the world. A matter of fact, when we convinced the Ethiopian government, and this is one of the arguments that we have. And also, I remember when we talked to the Prime Minister at that time, I think 4 or 5 years ago, he said, yeah, you're right, because this is about time for Lucy to stretch her legs, because she's been there for 30 years, and I remember that part. So yes, you're right, Lucy belongs really to the world, aside to the scientific research and the scientific, up and down, but it really belongs to the world, and we need to share it with the world, so you're right.
We have at the museum, when you go from the historic section of the exhibit, which is the first half of the exhibit, and walk into the second part of the exhibit, which deals with human evolution and human origins, there are 2 more rooms in that section. The first room you walk into is one that has a number of replicas of other hominids as they have been found in Ethiopia as well as elsewhere, and a video that shows Dr. Johansson talking about the discovery, but it also has, for those who like to read and ask interesting questions like you did, a lot of panels that start out with how do we know, how old was Lucy, and that refers to dating Lucy. But we didn't want to call it dating Lucy because then people might walk in and think, ooh, I'm going to learn about it. And that's not what we're about. Also, things like how do we know that she walked upright? That's been discussed as well. What was her environment like, and how do we know that? And with regard to dating, now, granted, I can say a few things, and then perhaps Dr. Kappelman can correct me or go beyond, but there are a number of dating techniques that we are familiar with. And sometimes you have people come up and ask, so radiocarbon dating, right, for Lucy? No. It is a well-known dating technique, but it doesn't go far back in time enough. At best, I think it can reach back roughly 50,000 years, maybe a little bit more. That is not far enough, not nearly far enough to get down to Lucy. So there are other ways in which you can date Lucy. And one of the dating techniques that was originally used, I think, was called potassium argon, and now it has been tweaked to argon, which gave rise at one point to some of our very keen readers that are among our docents at the museum, who noticed the reference to argon, and they said, hey, you made a mistake, it's potassium argon. No, it's actually argon, where we are dealing with gases that are included in the matrix in which you find the bones, which are then taken to a lab, and you are starting to go through, this is nuclear physics, and that is way above my pay grade. But we are talking about a decay, a radioactive decay from one type of gas, argon gas, into another one, and the scientists can measure the differences, the ratios, and then determine based on the ratios how far back in time you had to go to get to the point when that rock was deposited. I hope I'm getting at least a B here, or maybe a C+. But another thing you can also use, and that is used in African paleoanthropology a lot, is that you are extremely lucky, I would say, if you are somebody who can find a hominid fossil. It is probably more likely, but still you have to be lucky, that you will find fossils of animals that live in Africa at certain periods. And so there is another way in which you can sometimes also determine the age of a fossil, a hominid fossil, and that is if you find it in conjunction with or in stratigraphic association with animal bones that have perhaps already been dated somewhere else more securely. And I would argue that what you try to do, as always, is apply as many approaches as possible to date. So if you can do the argon or potassium argon, do that. And ideally, you will send off samples to various labs so you get different results or different replies, and hopefully they're all the same. And then you combine that with data from, say, the animal kingdom and see if those dates come in. And so then you start to get a firmer grip on how old Lucy was. It will always be, mind you, and I know everybody here knows that, it's plus or minus. We have not discovered a dating technique yet that will come back saying, you know what, on August 1st, 3.2 million years ago, Lucy walked around over here. We haven't gotten that yet. Maybe one day. So I will turn it over to our real specialist here.
You really picked up at the end there. Just briefly with that we didn't date Lucy, so Lucy doesn't have a date on it, on herself. That what we do is date the geologic context around Lucy. We don't have any technique to actually date a fossil, except when we're looking at carbon, because carbon's in recently dead animals within the 40 to 50,000 years that Dirk mentioned. But what we do have are these complementary techniques. So the radioisotopic dating and argon was a dramatic increase in resolution. That the minuses, plus and minuses, drop dramatically with that. We can tie that in with the relative faunal dating, and if we have those faunal elements, the other mammals dated from another section, we can pull that in. And then there's also paleomagnetic dating, which I do it's a method in geophysics where we look at how the Earth's core has reversed its magnetic direction over time. And my dad, who has always been a farmer, he mostly understands what I do, but there are a few points there where I haven't been clear enough probably. And he was in talking to one of his surgeons one time for a knee transplant or something. The surgeon, well, what do your kids do? So he went through the litany of all 6 of us, what we do. And he got to me and he said, oh, my son, he dates rocks. And the surgeon said, yeah, I've had a few of those myself. But anyway, but that's how we work that stuff out.
Yes, I had a question for Dr. Kappelman. Earlier you mentioned the announcement in the media about 2 weeks ago about the gorilla teeth, I believe, that were found. And I was just wondering, the media presented it as somewhat of a revolutionary discovery, and I was wondering if what the significance of that was, and also how that might relate to the Lucy fossil.
Well, this was an announcement in Nature 2 or 3 weeks ago, something like that, by a Japanese paleontologist, Jen Sua, who works in Ethiopia, has for a very long time, and is associated with Tim White's group out of Berkeley. that it's a handful of teeth, but gorilla teeth are very distinctive and they're thin enameled. Lucy's teeth have very thick enamel on them, and that's unusual. So, and the morphology, and Jen does CAT scanning as well, micro CT also, and so he had some very nice data on that. It's a small sample. We're not sure exactly that they're gorillas. The chances of nailing that group with the first ape that dates to 10 million years of age, I think, again, there's going to be great diversity at that point, but it may be a member of that group. The fact is, for gorillas, and basically for chimps, we don't have any fossil chimps or gorillas, period. We have no fossil record for gorillas and chimps. The oldest chimps, there have been some found by Sally McBurdy's group in western Kenya, published within the last couple of years. Again, just a handful of teeth. Most of those date back to about 500,000 years in age. We think the common ancestor of chimps and gorillas, based on molecular DNA data, was probably between 6 to 8 to 10, maybe million years ago, probably in that middle range, 7 or so, 7 or 8. So it's just remarkable we don't have any. That doesn't mean there weren't fossil gorillas or chimps. The fact is that their ranges today are in the Congo. That's an area that's undergoing net subsidence. One of the things that makes Ethiopia so great is that the country is literally being ripped apart by geologic forces. There's a plate boundary there. It's splitting off. And that thrusts rocks up that preserve the fossils up in the air for us to look at. In another probably 60 or 70 million years from now, when Africa and South America crash back together, the Congo will be elevated, and then we're going in.
Could I add something? I would like to add one comment to this, and that is your question at the very end asked, how does it relate to Lucy? And that is interesting in that a lot of people, media included as well, I've been at one press conference in Addis Ababa, whenever a fossil is found, it doesn't matter how much bone or how many teeth were found, but the question inevitably comes up, and I think it's an interesting one, and it underscores the iconic value, if you can call it that, of Lucy, and that is, how does it relate to Lucy? It is a very interesting question, but in this case we're talking about at least, 6 million years difference. But still, Lucy retains that rock star that we heard earlier, rock star status, because she was found early on and she was so important for so many different reasons. So she is and remains a yardstick that is being used, and she is right across the park, right at the museum for you to see.
I wonder if I could hijack for just a brief moment. I'm a cultural anthropologist with fieldwork experience in Africa, and the question about sort of the ability of Lucy to represent the world just made me think, given the number of students here, that I think one of the saddest things with my own fieldwork in Tanzania was when Africans would be standing next to me watching big hordes of tourists going on safari and turn to me and say, you know, I will never see the animals in my own country. And so I would just like to remind us that when we have issues and discussions of patrimony, understand that we come from this in a very privileged position, that we have all of this wealth of money available to get something like this, whereas the Africans themselves may not have any access to it. I just wanted to remind us that when we talk about what she means to us, let us also remember that is a very privileged position. And we need to be respectful of other people when they do object to the idea of us in some ways seizing her and taking the meaning to ourselves and forgetting them in the process. Thank you.
Those are very good remarks. Thank you. I would like to add to that while she is in Addis, I'm talking about Lucy, or Dinkenesh, as she's also known over in Ethiopia, she has been on display twice. Otherwise, nobody can go see her, even if you are in Ethiopia, for that matter. So that is not a matter we can decide. That is a discussion that has to be had internally by the Ethiopian authorities and the museum authorities. We are, however, grateful that she is currently on display because of an initiative that was taken by the Ethiopians. She will go back, and who knows, there might be occasion in the future for additional displays of Lucy, certainly.
Could we just do a couple more questions here, and then there was one in the center back, and then you can all, after we're finished, you can come up and ask your questions individually, because we've had a great session here, but it's getting late, and I've got to get Dr. Kappelman to the airport.
My question is for Dirk. I was actually wondering if you received any correspondence from Leakey or any other concerned paleontologists before they sent their press releases out. And if not, like, what do you suppose are the politics behind that decision?
Right, thank you very much for your question. I did not receive any correspondence ahead of time from Richard or Meave or anybody else. I did have the privilege of meeting Meave in the early days of the project before my name was better known, shall I say, when the Leakey Foundation actually was here in Texas and having its annual meeting at UT, where they also, I think, went and saw the CAT scanning facility. And I am in awe by the work that Richard Leakey and his family and his father and mother have done, and now a third generation is coming online. So there's a tremendous amount of work that has been done in the field of paleoanthropology, and we all owe them a debt of gratitude. However, I think, personally speaking, that it is sad that a person of his stature had to resort to those kinds of comments that are unbecoming, I believe, to his stature, and that we should have had a conversation as opposed to a slam dunk and a slap in the face. There's not a discussion. That is just a shutting down. This is the verbal equivalent, if you want, of an atomic bomb. I cannot respond to that in kind because I don't want to. I want to have a discussion that is open. And we have extended that to everybody, Ethiopian community included, other researchers as well. As a matter of fact, before this exhibit really took hold, when we were really preparing for it, I have email conversations and phone conversations with other people who have expressed their concerns, and I would say in a more polite way, and I completely understand and respect that. And those conversations led up to a certain point where I was told, no, we cannot go beyond, and I respect that position. But the other part, the other way of expressing one's deeply held beliefs is not the way I would do it. So that's the Reader's Digest version of what I wanted to tell you.
I'm curious about some details of Lucy's itinerary for the 6 years that she's here. In particular, what are the other museums she'll be going to? Are there others besides the Smithsonian that have refused her? Is she going to other universities? And to what extent were those decisions made based on financial versus educational aspects?
At this point, we are working on finalizing the tour. We have a list of objects that are in the exhibit. We of course know Lucy is in the exhibit. I will never refer to her as an object, but she's part of the show. So now that we have that particular type of information, we have been working with museums in the United States, and we have had plenty of inquiries, and actually museum representatives from various museums in the United States came to the opening and were very impressed, but that doesn't mean they're going to sign right away. We are working with them, and once the decisions are made by the various museums, then we will make that knowledge public, and I'm sure that whoever will take the next venue or next venues will also be making that public through their own media and PR people. So at this point, the only thing I can say is we're working on it. We do want to share her. Obviously, she's not ours. She belongs to mankind. And we do want to see the tour happen over the full 6 years, as was permitted, to go throughout the United States, to have as many people as possible, including young ones. And I saw a young researcher up on the top who was also raising his hand, because that is one of the things that we want to see happen. At the museum here, for example, one of our main missions is that of education. And a good example of people, myself, if you have good teachers, maybe they set you on the right career path. Hopefully, 20 years, 30 years down the line, I hope to hear somebody say, you know what, when I saw that Lucy exhibit, that really pulled me in. That spark was conveyed from the exhibit to me, and I wanted to pursue that further. And so the more people get to see her, the more venues we can line up throughout the United States, east to west, north to south, the more chances are, or the greater the chances are that such a transfer of the spark might happen. So stay tuned. That will definitely be made public, and probably within the next 2 months.
If I could just add something to that, and it responds to the question that, or the comment up above about the privileged position that we're in, and oftentimes that we aren't giving back as much as we can. I guess that with regard to the exhibit, I think we stand a chance with this being here for 6 years that we will have millions of American school kids work through this exhibit. That's going to hit a lot of our kids. It's not going to hit them all, though, and that was really the point of my lab group's initiative, and we did this independently to build this elucy.org site. What that provides, actually, we're aiming that at elementary kids and elementary school teachers. It provides a series of curriculum materials that any teacher anywhere on planet Earth or beyond, will beam into outer space too, I guess, can download these materials and literally walk little Lucy into their classroom for a day, a week. We've got all sorts of things posted to the site, all kinds of puzzles, word finds, the fossil itself. We don't have photographs of the actual fossil, but of our cast, comparative anatomy of that. And so, as best we can, we're using the internet as a way to bridge that sort of a gap. And it may seem, again, with our privilege and the digital divide, that we're in a preferred position for that. But I'll tell you, having worked in Ethiopia for 15 years, the number of internet cafes there that have propped up, it's just remarkable. And we've also aimed many of these materials so that anybody with a web link and an 8.5 by 11 black and white printer can download this stuff. So they don't have to have a fat pipeline to look at rotating skulls. We've got paper-based exercises for them, including a full-size printout of the Lucy skeleton reconstruction. So if you want that, you can print it out and put it on your wall as your poster. But anyway, that's our give back to this, that the internet and its worldwide availability permits us to step past that in a way that we never could before. And so we'll probably launch that site in another 10 days or so.
Last question.
Hi. Since it's no longer thought, as Dr. Kappelman said, that the advantage of walking upright was evolved due to seeing over the brush, what is the current evolutionary hypothesis for the advantage of walking upright?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's one that we can actually be informed some in looking at how other animals, why are some other animals bipedal? Some of the most interesting data on that have to do with field studies of chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are quadrupeds, they're knuckle walkers. They do move bipedally at points, but their anatomy really isn't designed for that. So there have been workers who've gone into the field and asked that question, when is it that chimpanzees are most commonly bipedal? The times that they're most bipedal is when they're standing up in the trees, positioned usually with one hand and feeding on small objects. So that upright stance gives them a much wider feeding radius than they would if they were bent down. So what we may see here is a series of adaptive steps or plateaus in that evolution where it was more of a postural point of an adaptation first that was later co-opted into a locomotor one. And again, with our predatory background, that we're always interested in movement. You ask primatologists what they do, or functional morphologists, it's movement, movement, movement. Fact is, what do we do most of our time? What we're doing right now, we sit around. And so posture is one of those things that really hasn't been investigated to the same degree that locomotion has, again, because we're these visual animals that are always tracking movement. But what appears to be the case is that there may have been these different stages for that adaptation, and then it was later co-opted for locomotion. The selective advantage may have been for feeding, and we know that feeding drives most of the adaptations we see in the skeleton and the teeth. So surprise, it may well drive what the rest of the skeleton looks like too. But those are some of the most exciting data. And then as we recover more fossils that are even older, some of the material, the Sahelanthropus material from Chad that dates to about 7 million, based on the cranial remains, looks like it may have been bipedal too. We don't have any published postcrania of that yet, but the French group that's working there, stay tuned. So that is very interesting as well, but that's another 4 million years older than Lucy. So bipedalism may be the keystone adaptation of our group.
All right, I want to thank you all for your wonderful questions and your engagement with this. I think this has been an extremely productive panel, and I hope that it served to remind us all of the important place that museums play in our society, that they are important sites for very meaningful conversations, but those conversations take place best when we have courageous museum curators and museum presidents who do not shy away from controversial exhibits. And I think we can feel very good that we have a museum in this community that takes on difficult topics and is not intimidated by them. So I want to thank Joel Barsh for for being that kind of president, and Dirk van Tuerenhout for being that kind of curator. And thanks to all of the panelists for coming tonight, to particularly Dr. Kappelman, who's traveled from Austin to be with us. I also want to thank our events coordinator, Ellen Butler, who put this event together admirably in a very short period of time. The technical staff that, as always, support us. This will be available as a webcast and a podcast. And to all of you in the audience for coming out tonight. Thank you very much for spending the evening with us. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.